Crimea under fire, how Ukraine's Neptune missiles are reshaping the Black Sea War. For most of this war, Crimea has functioned as something like Russia's safe room. It's the place where the Black Sea Fleet could retreat to resupply, repair battle damage, and regroup, all while feeling reasonably confident that the peninsula itself was untouchable. That confidence has been eroding steadily for the better part of 2 years now. And there's one piece of technology in particular that explains a lot of why. A missile called Neptune. Let's start with where this weapon came from, because the backstory actually matters for understanding why it's become such a problem for Moscow. Neptune is a domestically produced Ukrainian cruise missile, originally conceived as a coastal defense system. The whole point, in its earliest form, was to give Ukraine a way to threaten Russian warships that got too close to its coastline. It wasn't designed to reach deep inland or to strike fixed targets on land. It was built to sink ships. And it did exactly that in spectacular fashion early in the war. Neptune is the missile credited with sinking the Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, back in April of 2022. That single strike reshaped how the rest of the world thought about this conflict. Here was a country with a fraction of Russia's naval power using a missile system it had only just begun fielding, and it took out the pride of an entire fleet. It was a signal, even in those early months, that Ukraine's approach to this war was going to lean heavily into asymmetry, using cheaper, smarter, more precisely targeted weapons to offset Russia's overwhelming advantage in raw size and firepower. Since then, Ukraine has continued developing the platform, and crucially, it has extended its range. What started as a coastal defense missile aimed at moving targets at sea has evolved into a weapon capable of reaching much deeper into occupied Crimea, striking fixed infrastructure on land rather than only ships on the water. And that shift, from purely defensive and naval-focused to offensive and infrastructure-focused, is a much bigger deal than it might sound like at first. Think about the difference in what each capability actually threatens. A missile that can only hit ships forces an adversary to be careful about where it sails its fleet. That's a real constraint, but it's a narrow one. A missile that can also reach ammunition depots, fuel storage facilities, repair yards, and logistics hubs on land threatens something much larger: the entire support system that keeps a fleet functional in the first place. You can have a perfectly intact warship sitting in port, completely undamaged, and still have it be functionally useless if there's no fuel to put in its tanks, no ammunition to reload into its launchers, and no working repair facility nearby if something breaks. Hit the logistics, and you don't need to sink every ship. You just need to make sure none of them can actually do anything. This is exactly the logic that seems to be driving a lot of Ukraine's strikes in and around Sevastopol specifically. And it's worth taking a moment to talk about why Sevastopol, of all places, keeps coming up again and again in this story. Sevastopol isn't just another port city. It's the historic home of the Black Sea Fleet, and it carries enormous symbolic weight for Russia. This is the place Moscow points to when it wants to argue that Crimea is permanently, irreversibly part of Russia. It's also, practically speaking, where Russia has concentrated the bulk of the logistics infrastructure that keeps the fleet running. Ammunition storage sites, fuel depots, ship repair facilities, and the vessels themselves whenever they're not actively at sea. So when you're trying to degrade an adversary's naval capability without actually fighting their navy ship to ship, which Ukraine simply doesn't have the resources to do, targeting that logistics backbone in Sevastopol becomes an incredibly efficient use of limited resources. You don't need a massive navy of your own. You need precision weapons that can find their way past air defenses and electronic jamming to reach a warehouse full of ammunition or a fuel storage cluster. And you need to do it often enough that it actually disrupts the rhythm of how the fleet operates. Now let's talk about why this is actually hard to do. Because Russia hasn't exactly left Crimea undefended. Quite the opposite. Moscow has poured enormous resources into building up what's supposed to be one of the densest, most modern air defense networks anywhere in the region. There are long-range systems designed to intercept aircraft, large drones, and cruise missiles at significant distances. There are shorter-range point defense systems meant to catch anything that slips past that outer layer. On paper, this should make Crimea, and Sevastopol specifically, an extraordinarily difficult place to hit, and yet it keeps getting hit, repeatedly. So what's going on there? Why does a defense network this sophisticated keep failing to stop these attacks? The honest answer is that modern air defense systems, even very good ones, are generally built and optimized around a particular kind of threat profile. They're designed to detect and intercept things that are relatively large, relatively fast, and flying at meaningful altitude. Fighter jets, bombers, big reconnaissance drones, conventional cruise missiles cruising along at a few thousand feet. That's the threat these systems were conceived to handle. And for that kind of threat, they tend to perform quite well. What they're much less naturally suited for is something small, slow, and flying just a few dozen feet above the water, especially when the weather isn't cooperating. Add in fog, add in rough seas creating wave clutter on a radar screen, and you've got a recipe for a defense system that starts to struggle distinguishing a genuine threat from background noise. Ukraine appears to have built its entire attack profile around exploiting exactly that gap. Sea-skimming flight paths that keep missiles just above the waves, small drones and unmanned surface vessels that barely register on radar in the first place, and deliberate use of decoys designed to draw attention and burn through expensive interceptor missiles before the real attack ever shows up. None of this is about overpowering Russian air defense through brute force. It's about finding the seams, the places where a genuinely capable system still has blind spots, and threading an attack directly through them. There's another layer to this fight that doesn't get talked about as much as missiles and drones, and that's electronic warfare. Russia relies heavily on jamming systems to protect Crimea, equipment specifically designed to disrupt the communication and guidance links that Ukrainian drones and missiles depend on to find their targets. And this has become, in a lot of ways, just as central to the contest as the physical weapons themselves. If a jamming system successfully scrambles a drone's control signal or distorts a missile's targeting data, an entire attack can be neutralized without a single interceptor ever being fired. So how does Ukraine deal with that? Largely by designing around the dependency rather than trying to brute force through it. Missiles equipped with inertial guidance systems, ones that don't rely entirely on external signals to find their way, can continue on a pre-programmed flight path even if jamming manages to scramble the data coming in from outside. It's a bit like the difference between navigating by GPS versus navigating by dead reckoning. If someone jams your GPS, dead reckoning still gets you where you're going just based on the course you'd already calculated before you lost the signal. Reconnaissance drones operating at higher altitudes, often relying on satellite communication links rather than the more easily jammed line-of-sight connections, can also keep feeding targeting information back even when lower altitude systems are getting scrambled. And in some cases, it appears Ukraine has specifically targeted the jamming systems themselves as part of an attack sequence, recognizing that taking out the source of the interference can clear the way for everything else following behind it. This back and forth, jam, adapt, find a way around the jamming, sometimes even target the jammer directly, is genuinely one of the more fascinating and underappreciated dimensions of this entire war. It's a fight happening largely in the electromagnetic spectrum, invisible to the naked eye, but every bit as consequential as the explosions that eventually make the news. Now I want to address something that I think a lot of people get wrong when they hear about strikes on warehouses and fuel depots rather than direct hits on warships. There's a tendency to think of that as somehow the lesser outcome. Like, sure, they blew up a fuel depot, but did they actually sink anything? And I get why that instinct exists. Sinking a ship makes for a much more dramatic headline. But strategically, degrading the logistics behind a fleet can be just as significant, and in some ways even more significant than sinking an individual vessel. Here's why. A warship that gets sunk is one ship gone. That's a real loss, but it's a contained one. A fleet that loses its ability to resupply, rearm, and refuel efficiently becomes constrained across its entire operational capacity, not just with respect to one vessel. Every ship in that fleet becomes more cautious about how far it's willing to operate from port because the support infrastructure it depends on has gotten less reliable. Maintenance schedules slip, patrol patterns become more conservative. The entire tempo of operations slows down, not because any one ship was destroyed, but because the system supporting all of them got weaker. And there's a psychological dimension here too, one that I think matters more than people sometimes give it credit for. When strikes keep successfully landing inside what's supposed to be one of Russia's most secure rear areas, areas protected by exactly the kind of layered, modern air defense network that's meant to make this sort of thing impossible, it chips away at something beyond just the physical infrastructure. It chips away at the entire narrative Moscow has tried to build around Crimea since 2014. That this is settled, secured territory, firmly and permanently part of Russia, beyond the reach of any meaningful Ukrainian response. Every successful strike undermines that story a little bit more. If a heavily defended naval base near Sevastopol can still be hit repeatedly, despite radar networks, despite interceptor missiles, despite electronic jamming, then what exactly does secure mean anymore? That's not a comfortable question for Russian officials to be sitting with, and it's not a comfortable question for ordinary residents of the peninsula either, the people who actually have to live there day to day and watch the sky for the next attack. So where does this leave things? What does this pattern actually tell us about how this war has evolved and where it might be heading? I think the broader story here is about asymmetry and about how a country without the resources to fight a conventional, symmetrical naval war has instead leaned hard into precision, deception, and exploiting narrow technical gaps in an adversary's defenses. Ukraine isn't trying to build a navy that can match Russia's Black Sea Fleet ship for ship. That's simply not a realistic path given the resource disparity involved. Instead, the approach has been to make every individual strike count for as much as possible, to combine cheap decoys with expensive precision weapons in a way that maximizes the cost imposed on Russia relative to what Ukraine actually has to spend to pull it off. And it's working well enough that Russia keeps having to respond. Air defense systems that were originally positioned with certain threat assumptions in mind get repositioned, sometimes in ways that create new vulnerabilities elsewhere. Jamming systems get deployed more aggressively, which then becomes its own kind of arms race as Ukraine adapts its targeting and guidance to work around the interference. Resources that Russia might otherwise have directed toward offensive operations elsewhere in the war end up tied down instead, protecting rear areas that were once considered comfortably safe. That's really the core insight here, I think. This isn't really a story about one dramatic missile strike, even if any individual incident makes for a compelling headline. It's a story about a sustained campaign that, strike by strike, has forced Russia to treat Crimea as an active front rather than a secure rear base. And once a place like that starts requiring constant defensive attention, it stops functioning the way it was supposed to function. It stops being the safe room. For Russia, the implication going forward is genuinely uncomfortable. Maintaining the Black Sea Fleet's ability to operate at any meaningful tempo now requires defending not just the ships themselves out at sea, but the entire chain of logistics infrastructure sitting behind them, stretched across a peninsula that Ukraine has demonstrated again and again that it can still reach. Layered air defense remains a real and serious obstacle. Electronic warfare remains a real and serious obstacle. But neither has proven to be the impenetrable shield Moscow was presumably hoping for when it invested so heavily in fortifying the peninsula after 2014, and especially after the full-scale invasion began in 2022. And I think that's ultimately the most important takeaway from watching how this particular front of the war has developed. Crimea was supposed to be the example of what total Russian control looked like, the proof that occupation could be made permanent and secure. Instead, it's become one of the clearest illustrations in this entire conflict of just how difficult permanent security actually is to achieve against an adversary that's willing to be patient, creative, and relentless about finding the gaps in even the most sophisticated defenses. Whether that translates into something more decisive down the road, whether the cumulative pressure on Crimea eventually forces a broader strategic shift, is still an open question. But what's not really in question anymore is whether these strikes matter. They clearly do. Every time another depot burns or another logistics hub gets disrupted, it's one more data point in an accumulating pattern that Russia has struggled to reverse, despite throwing enormous resources at the problem. It's worth stepping back for a second and thinking about what this means in the context of the broader war, beyond just the Black Sea specifically. Ukraine has shown a consistent pattern throughout this conflict of identifying where its adversary is overextended or overconfident, and then patiently building the capability to exploit exactly that weakness. We saw it with artillery shortages pushing the development of drone warfare on land. We're seeing it here with naval limitations pushing the development of long-range precision strike capability against fixed infrastructure. In both cases, the response to a resource disadvantage wasn't to try to match Russia's capacity directly, which would have been an impossible task, but to find a more efficient, more precise way of imposing costs that Russia's larger resource base couldn't easily absorb or counter. That pattern of adaptation is probably the single most important thing to understand about how this war has actually been fought, as opposed to how a lot of people initially expected it to be fought back in early 2022. Nobody predicted at the outset that a country with no real navy to speak of would end up forcing Russia's flagship to the bottom of the Black Sea within the first couple months of the war, and then go on to mount a sustained, years-long campaign against the fleet's home base that continues to produce real, measurable disruption to this date. That outcome required a level of technical innovation, operational creativity, and sheer persistence that genuinely reshaped expectations about what a smaller, resource-constrained military can accomplish against a much larger adversary, provided it's willing to think differently about where and how to apply pressure. And that, I think, is really the story underneath the story here. It's not just about one missile system, however impressive Neptune's evolution has been from a coastal defense weapon into something capable of reaching deep into occupied territory. It's about an entire approach to fighting an asymmetric war that keeps finding new ways to make a numerically and materially superior adversary pay a disproportionate price for trying to hold on to territory it once assumed was simply safe. Crimea was supposed to be the proof of permanence. Instead, it's become one of the clearest demonstrations in this entire war of how difficult permanence actually is to maintain when the other side simply refuses to accept it as settled.